And now let's get to our presentation. Our presenter, Jonathan Kopal, has been involved in the IT industry for more than 25 years. He's the VP of Infrastructure and Security and a founding partner at ITX Corporation. It's headquartered in Rochester, New York. ITX is a software company focused on developing and hosting software product solutions for local and national clients. The company was established to help clients solve complex problems through technology. Jonathan leads a team of computer security and cloud infrastructure specialists. He brings value to client-facing work with his expertise in multiple security domains, including compliance, risk management, software development, operations, and infrastructure. In addition to all this, Jonathan is a mentor for SCORE Buffalo Niagara, and glad to have him. We're pleased to have Jonathan presenting tonight. And with that said, Jonathan, the microphone and the controls are yours. Go ahead.
All right, thank you. Appreciate the generous introduction, Ted. And thank you for those of you who came to attend this webinar. Again, just to talk a little bit more about my background, I've been part of a growing small business since the late 90s, and I've been specializing and focusing on security for ourselves and for our customers for over a decade. So this is stuff that I'm really passionate about, and it's stuff that we see in the context of owning and operating a small business. What we do at ITX, we develop software and we host websites. And in that role, I wear a couple of hats. One of them is the corporate policy and compliance hat. This means keeping us essentially out of the newspaper, right? We don't want to have a problem where we have a security breach or an incident because it results in a breach of trust with our clients. Additionally, I work with our software development teams to advocate for our teams to build good, secure software, because the other side of the coin is when we're building software going out to our customers, they expect their product that we build for them to be secure, so that we can help keep them off of the front page of the newspaper. And so those are my two big goals when I'm doing this work. And so that leads me down the path of, what are the risks that I manage on a day-to-day basis? A big part of that risk is mitigating against people who might want to attack us. We would call them hackers, right? So the big question is, why are they doing this, right? And the reasons for this have changed a lot since the first time somebody wrote a virus back in the days of DOS and IBM PS2 machines and simpler computers back in the 90s, right? The primary motives that people have are financial. They might want to extract cash payments, essentially get you to pay them for some kind of an extortion scheme. They may want to extract financial information or financial related information from you so that they can go directly to either drain your bank accounts or something similar. Or finally, they might want to obtain valuable information or sellable information. This might be personally identifiable information. In some cases, it might be information that they would hold as ransom, again, to be able to extract money from you as part of a ransom technique. Essentially, they would say, I've downloaded all of your client information. If you don't want me to publish this to the world, you're going to pay me to not do that. Right. So financial motives tend to be the primary reason why we see this happening. It's not always people coming in from another country. We see the highest number of attacks targeted from people here in the US, but it also is sometimes people in other countries who are desperate for hard currency. For instance, North Korea as a threat actor is a great example of them employing people specifically to attack larger companies or entities that might have enough cash to make a difference to their financial position in the world market. Another common thing we do see is, we call it the lulls. There are occasionally people who will attack a site just for the pleasure of being able to brag about having defaced a website or whatever. It's not uncommon. You see it less as a professional opportunity, for instance. I know it doesn't seem reasonable to think of hackers as professionals, but they think of themselves that way. But you might find people who are just doing it in the same way that somebody might use graffiti to tag a building, right? It's just bad manners and and not doing it for any ulterior motive other than just being kind of a nasty person. Less common than that, but we sometimes see it, right? You see it, people um, making computer attacks for political reasons, not only terrorism, or when city states or nation states are at war with each other, they may attack each other for reasons, political reasons, to defend their own country or attack the country they're at war with, or for other political reasons. Anonymous is a good example of a group of attackers that will attack maybe a. I remember there was a story they attacked Russia um, and defaced, I think, the Kremlin's website. And that was a politically motivated attack. They didn't get any profit out of it. It was just, to say, hey, we're the good guys and you're the bad guys, and this is how we're going to prove it. Again, there's state sponsorship of attackers, either for political reasons or financial motives. Russia is another good example of that. We see a lot of financially motivated attacks like ransomware and such, where the operators are state sanctioned as long as they're attacking Americans or other citizens of Western countries that aren't friendly or aren't necessarily friendly with Russia. And then finally, and this is like the first one, this might be relevant, is what we'd call corporate espionage, but it could also be what you'd consider like a competitor attack. I recently read of an attack, for instance, two small businesses. They both sold the same thing. One of them went onto the other's website, bought out all their inventory. So that inventory went to zero. Their customers then came to the first company's website, went shopping, bought the stuff, and then they immediately canceled the order so that the inventory went back to normal, right? So that was, not the hacker in the way that we think about it, but it's still a type of attack where somebody is taking advantage of a weakness in another system to compromise that system. So again, just as a reminder as we go on, if you have any questions, don't be afraid to pop them in the chat. If the questions are relevant to the slide that we're talking about, I'll stop and address it right then. Oftentimes, as a specialist, I might use language that may not be completely clear, or maybe a specialized language, and I can help define that better for you if you need. If the question isn't necessarily immediately relevant, then we'll save it for the end. But don't be afraid to use the chat as kind of a parking lot so you can capture stuff. Okay. So what happens when you're attacked by a hacker or some kind of a cyber threat, right? The best case outcome is that you're inconvenienced and you lose some or all time, or slightly less than that, you might have to pay a service provider or somebody to help you to recover. But that's your best case scenario, is that you're inconvenienced. Worst case could be significantly worse, right? You may have financial losses. I had a client who had a ransomware attack, and they were required to pay in real cash to get what we call a decryption key, right? Which unlocked all of their files and all of the information that they had on their network so that they could continue to work. In the case of a state like New York or California, where you have to declare a breach, that declaration of a breach becomes public knowledge, right? So there's also the possibility that you have a damaged reputation with your clients or your stakeholders. Less so if you're in a product-related industry, but if you're in a knowledge-related industry, your clients already express some trust when they come to you to be your client. And so they trust that you won't put their information at risk, right? Again, you might have a loss of productivity. If you're dealing with an attack that brings down your network or brings down the computers for the people that work for you, they're essentially going to still expect to get paid, even though they're not doing something productive. Next, of course, as I mentioned, many states, including New York, including California, Nevada, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, many states now require that at minimum you disclose a breach if you'd had a breach. And that can lead to civil liabilities or regulatory consequences, as the consequences could be as small as oversight from the state attorney general for a period of time. But in some cases, a breach could result in a financial obligation. For instance, if you have a credit card breach, you have some real serious financial liabilities that you have to square up with your credit card merchant, with your provider, right? So definitely don't want to see something like that happen. But I'm not going to belabor the obvious, right? A bad enough breach where you lose your information could result in bankruptcy, and it's not uncommon when there's a major breach. Think about it like this. If your accounting system, say you're running QuickBooks, right? If your accounting system were to be compromised, you would have no longer have the ability to generate invoices or to know off the top of your head who owes you money because you no longer have access to your accounts receivable. You might lose your client list. You might not have a good handle on your inventory anymore. There's a lot of consequences just from losing your basic financial management information. If you can't collect your receivables, that could result in major financial consequences, up to and including bankruptcy. So this is pretty serious. We want to do what we can to help mitigate or to try to avoid being attacked if we can, and be good caretakers of our information. So this was a report from just a couple years ago from our friends at Cisco. Cisco makes stuff for protecting businesses. But what I really want to focus on here is small businesses, right? That's us. That's me and my business over in ITX. And that's probably most of you. And so if you take a look at the attack types for small businesses, right? Because that's our focus here. I would break it down into two major attack types. The first one is malware, right? Malware is defined as a piece of software that is designed to do something bad on your computer, right? Malicious software is what it stands for. And this is anything from spyware to ransomware to malware that's deployed onto your mobile phone for whatever reason, either to be able to read it, to read what it's doing, to capture keystrokes, to be able to get or intercept passwords, that type of thing. The other classification in our top 5 is essentially what we'd call impersonation attacks. These are attacks where somebody is purporting to be somebody that they're not. In the two cases here, stolen credentials means that they're stealing your credentials so that they can have access to the things that you have access to as if they're you. In the case of phishing, they're talking to you or your team as if they're somebody that you trust, even though they might not be. In both of those cases, we have a problem with managing the identity of the attacker, right? Where they're pretending to be somebody they're not. And I'm just going to talk about the top 5. If somebody has a specific question about one of the other ones, I would love to get into it, but those top 5 are really the highest risk ones that we have on our table. And so I'm going to focus on those for the conversation tonight. And again, if you want to say, hey, I'd like to ask about managing spam or something like that, we'll put it in the parking lot and we can pull it into the Q&A section at the end. Okay. So first, let's talk about malware attacks, right? The 3 that we called out here, ransomware, spyware, and mobile malware. Just so that we're clear, ransomware is a piece of software that is designed to start running in a way that's secret to you. So you might have an attachment that comes in an email, or you might go to a website and that ransomware launches from the website. In either cases, it starts up and it runs in the background of your computer without you knowing. And it does one or two of two things. The first thing it does, it may do is what we call exfiltrating your data. So in this case, they may actually read your data and upload it to their own personal web servers. This is for being able to review what that data is. They may look it over and decide whether or not that data has value in and of itself, either sellable value, or if it's data that's private or confidential, they might be able to hold that for ransom, right? So that's called a disclosure attack, where they say, we will disclose this information to your competitors or to your customers unless you pay us not to. The other thing ransomware typically does in the background is it will encrypt all of the data that it can find. So that may be the files on your hard drive, or if you're operating a network in an office, it may reach out to the file server in your office and start encrypting those files. And by encryption, what we mean is it will render those files unreadable without the key to unlock them or decrypt them. And so the purpose of the attack is for them to tell you that you need to pay them money to get those data decrypted. A second attack here is what we call spyware. In this case, they're not necessarily doing anything to your data, but they're reading your computer and monitoring the way you use your computer. In many cases, for instance, we'll see attacks where the spyware will operate and then try to identify things like usernames and passwords on the computer. They may read your email. The spyware is oftentimes used for either to identify information that might be sellable for a profit. For instance, our insurance company will reach out to us if for some reason they were to see some of our data that's been breached that would be out on the web, right? So this is one of the services that they have. So if they see on the dark web that ITX data is available, they'll reach out to us and let us know, hey, we saw this potential disclosure. What's up with that? It's not a comfortable conversation. So we do our best to avoid that if we can. And then, of course, mobile malware is very similar, right? This is designed to run on a mobile device, and it's designed to read what's in that device, text messages, usernames and passwords, things like that, with the intent of acquiring information that might be useful either for a later attack or information that might be useful for sale, right? They might sell your password to somebody, or they might use your banking password to get into your bank account and execute transfers. Right? So what do we do after a malware attack, right? This is predicated on us discovering the attack. In the case of ransomware, you will be told that you've been attacked. In many cases, you'll know because your files are encrypted. In the case of spyware or the existence of mobile malware, oftentimes an antivirus program will tell you after a refresh, right? We call that post 0 day, right? 0 day is when the spyware is invented, so to speak. Your antivirus program doesn't know anything about it. So as your antivirus updates itself, it may detect that there's malware on your computer or spyware on your computer and inform you of that, right? So you or one of your users has unknowingly installed this software on your device. What do? And the first thing you do is, as soon as you know there's a problem, you want to disconnect that system from the network or the internet. If it's on Wi-Fi, turn off its Wi-Fi interface, or if you can't do that, turn off your Wi-Fi router for a short term until you can get that machine isolated. The reason you want to do that is because if you are going to respond in an aggressive way, either by uninstalling the spyware or shutting down the attackers with a ransomware, you want to remove the possibility that they could exert any additional control. Now, the only exception with this, of course, is if you have been attacked by ransomware and you intend to pay the ransom to decrypt, right? That's a very personal decision. Usually I recommend that people have a conversation either with their insurer or with the FBI as part of that conversation, because in general, when you pay the ransom to get the decryption, the ransomware attackers will provide you with that key so that you can unlock your data. That being said, not every insurance company will accommodate that. And I know that at the executive level, the police are starting to discourage their clients from paying the ransom. The reason being that every time a person pays a ransom, it's an additional incentive on positive reinforcement to those attackers to continue with that as a profitable motive for continuing. So really want to think hard about that and decide what kind of position you're in. If you are isolating that system because you're shutting it down, the next step would be to do a good clean wipe of the device. Essentially, you want to restore it back to your original factory settings. After that, you would restore or reinstall your applications from a trusted source. For instance, QuickBooks, you probably would install it from the CD-ROM that you got it from, or go back to the original download that you had. And then after that, you would restore your data off of your backups. This, I acknowledge, can be a long and time-consuming process, but that would be the process in the case of one of these attacks, is to make sure that that system is clean before you start using it again, right? It's a hygiene thing in many cases. And then the last thing to do is contact authorities. Again, the FBI is typically interested and can oftentimes be very helpful in the case of a ransomware or a malware attack. But in the cases of a potential for a breach, if you have data that falls into the classification of data that should have been protected, you do need to disclose that to your authorities. All right, I've got a question. When getting a new mobile device, old data and content can be ported over to the new device. Would ransomware or spyware or malware port over to in this process? So my best answer is it is probably going to be as frustrating to you as it is to my partners, which is it depends. So if you're porting applications, usually the applications are going to be reinstalled from their original source. So that would be reinstalled off of typically the App Store, right? So if the App Store application, for instance, if you're running an Android device and you're doing it in the Google App Store, if Google hasn't done a good job and the App Store contains an app that contains malware, right? If that got through the App Store, then you would be reinstalling the malware. And unfortunately, there isn't much to do about it other than to notify Google or whomever that there is malware in their App Store so that they can clear it before you reinstall. That being said, the data that gets ported over, especially if you don't choose to reinstall that particular application, most of the rest of the data should be intact. Mobile phones work in a way where, in general, applications own their own data and there isn't a lot of crossing over the lines between applications. It's more of that in the Apple iOS space than it is on the Google or Android space. But typically, if you're doing a restore, especially if you're restoring off of an online backup with Apple or Google where you've stored it with your account, that's typically a safer way to do it. So, I think that's the best answer. Some examples of mobile malware. I'm not going to get into that today. I don't have any really strong examples on the top of my head. What we'll oftentimes see, though, is that a piece of software will get through the vetting process from Google or from Apple. Or alternatively, you might get a piece of software that you want to do with an Android device. You can do what's called side loading that software. Side loading means you install it in a way that bypasses the App Store. In that case, all bets are off in terms of security because there may not necessarily be somebody checking it. A third example would be in the case of malware that may have gotten through the checkers, like in the App Store on Android. This is a good example. It's not uncommon for people who are building malware to make their app look or sound very similar to a common app. So when you search in the App Store for Zoom, there might be another application that comes up in the same search results, but might be like ZOUM or some. I know that's kind of a bad example, but it's going to have a similar spelling or similar phonetic sounding name. And in that case, sometimes people will accidentally install that application. So in that case, you just want to be very cautious about making sure that the spelling right, making sure that it's calling out the original manufacturer. So if it's Zoom, that there's a company called Zoom as well, so it'll typically show the publisher in there. Or if it's Teams, the publisher is Microsoft, and you want to look to make sure the publisher matches the company that you expect to be making that software. The other type of malware, and this is less of a small business thing, but the other type of malware that we've seen are some of the malware that we're seeing by political actors. So there is a way to install malicious software on a phone via what we call a malformed text message. So somebody receives a text message with a link on it, where the link might auto execute. We've seen that again used by nation states to spy on either their own citizens, who might be political actors like journalists or that type of thing, or who might be trying to spy on a political actor of a competing nation state. So I think it's less likely that we would see something within the class of people called small business owners that looks like mobile malware or mobile attacks. It's more likely that you'll see stuff coming in through the App Store that might be that you might mistakenly install, or might have malware that gets through the checkers that Apple and Google has. So my best recommendation there is to be thoughtful and not to be too unhygienic about how many apps you install on your phone. If you're going with the default apps that have been installed, by all means, that's pretty safe. But if you're exploring other stuff, just be a little bit more cautious. And then finally, or next is impersonation attacks, right? So, wait, did we miss one? Oh yeah, hey, missed a slide. Sorry about that. So mitigation, right? How do we try to avoid this? And so, while mobile software is something that's interesting to talk about, more likely than not, we're going to see malicious software on desktop computers, desktops, laptops, that type of thing. And the reason is that on a mobile device, typically the path for an application to get onto that mobile device is through an app store. And so you are going to be, okay, I'm sorry. We'll stop for a second. Deborah, you asked another one. There is malware that can open or activate without my clicking on a link inside the text. The short answer is yes. Again, the long answer is you probably won't see that kind of thing. You're not a likely target of that kind of malware. Those types of software attacks are very difficult to craft. And so the people who have those tools at their disposal are not going to use them broadly to attack a large market of targets, because as soon as Apple or Google, who are the two main organizations that maintain our phones, as soon as they see those attacks, they'll usually issue a patch to get those attacks shut down. And those attackers, remember, these are typically state actors. Those attackers don't wish to lose their ability to use that tool. And so they typically exercise some real discretion. In the cases where there are malicious actors who are operating with these particular malware products, there's one actually that was originally based in Israel, and then they think they moved to another country, maybe Yemen or something like that, where the government was a little bit more friendly to them. But they were offering attacks at anywhere from $10,000 to $50,000 per attack as a service to governments, typically, right? So again, we're probably not going to be the targets of that because it's so difficult to do and so difficult to make work, that you have to be very intentional about it. And and it's a very It's a very challenging process to make it work just right. So I wouldn't worry about it here that much. If you do get a text message from somebody that you don't know, or an email from somebody that you don't know that has a link in it, certainly that's a great thing to be watchful for, because you can actively click on that link and install malicious software either on your desktop device or on your mobile device, right? So the difference is the unsophisticated malware requires that you act to start the process. It requires that you click on that link. The really sophisticated software that people are willing to pay tens of thousands of dollars for is something that can be crafted to install itself without any interaction from the end user. So other mitigations or preparations. So reason why we get here is because just like the Boy Scouts, it's best to be prepared. And the very first thing I'm going to say is because there is a risk to data, especially from things like ransomware attacks, one of the very best things that you can do for yourself and for your business is to set up backups and test them, right? Those are both very important things. One is think about the information that you literally would go out of business if you didn't have, the information that you literally can't operate without, and make sure it's backed up. And make sure you're regularly backing it up, right? So usually I recommend that people keep anywhere from 30 to 180 days worth of data backed up, depending on what method they're using for backing it up. A good compromise, if you're backing it up on a daily basis, is maybe 90 days. The reason for that is because oftentimes ransomware or other actor might install their malware quietly onto your computer and then let it sit for 30 days in the hopes that that they'll get past your backup window into a place where then they can execute themselves, and their software and their attack also lives inside of your backups. And you want to get to before the backups were initiated or before they were instantiated. So make sure you configure your backups, make sure they're running, make sure to regularly test them, right? It has happened to me more than once that I have talked to a client who has said, we were running backups, but they weren't backing anything up. And when we needed to do a restore, the backup wasn't there. And it was so heartbreaking to have that conversation with that client, because there's nothing that we can do once the data has been destroyed. I had a client that was a law firm that was actually in this exact scenario. They were attacked by ransomware. This was the worst case scenario. All of their data had been encrypted. They paid the ransom, and then the attacker actually ghosted them and did not give them the decryption key. So not only were they out the thousands of dollars to pay the ransom, but they also lost all of their data. It was awful. Like I said, it was absolutely heartbreaking. And I've had other stuff too. I know a lot of us don't use tapes anymore. In the olden days, we've had circumstances where tapes had been running and the tape was no longer good. But there are a lot of great low cost and in some cases free backup services that work great and are easy to configure, allow you to kind of select the data that you want to back up, and it just does its thing. So don't be afraid to take the time, and don't be afraid to occasionally take the time to do the restore. If it's not you doing the test restore, maybe it's somebody that works with you who's better than you at doing like routine things. But at least once every few weeks or once a month, somebody should dig into the restore and pull up an Excel file or pull up an old copy of the QuickBooks and see if QuickBooks can actually still open that file. Not only is it an excellent way to make sure that that's working, but it is so satisfying to pull up a file from a backup and be like, hey, that worked. Everything's working. I can at least have that checked off. So backup, backup, backup. I can't say it enough. Of course, make sure you have antivirus and anti-malware installed. Not every virus or malware application out there is a 0-day app. And in many cases, this can be intercepted by antivirus or anti-malware software, many of it free to use for small businesses. More sophisticated, but still useful, is something called DNS filtering. You can use a service like Google DNS or OpenDNS. DNS stands for Domain Name Services. It's the equivalent of a phone book for your computer. So if you think about what a phone book does, is you look up a name and it gives you a number, right? In the internet works the same way. Computers are assigned numbers, right? We call it an IP address. We use the domain name service to translate a name like www.score.com or score.org. Got that before Ted caught me on it, but www.score.org gets translated to a numeric address, right? So that's what that service does. Every machine has a numeric address. And so a DNS filtering service, what that does is they know many of the malware hosting websites, and they will simply not give you an answer. So when you go to www.threatactor.com, they'll be like, oh, doesn't exist. You can't even go there if you want to. And so many of the malware apps require remote control. So for instance, if you install ransomware, they won't start an encryption until they can connect back to their master. And so the DNS service intercepts that connection attempt to prevent it from calling home. So 2 questions really quick related to malware. What preferably free antivirus, anti-malware software would you recommend? I'm a big fan of, I've always been a big fan of AVG antivirus. They're pretty good. And I think I'm using, Avast on my computer. Avast is very good as well and has a free version. Many of the antivirus, we call them, instead of totally free, they're freemium products, which means that the base antivirus malware prevention product is free, and then they try to upsell you to their other services. The cool thing is their base product still works and has high integrity. So you can just use that, and you can tell it, no, thank you, I don't want the other services if you don't wish to pay for it. And generally speaking, they're free for personal use or for very small businesses like us. More like you. We've grown a little bit more. We've grown past the limit, which is typically like 5 or 10 users. The antivirus on Windows machines that comes for free on Windows is actually very good. So if you're running Windows and not Mac, I would find that satisfactory. So I would say make sure you don't turn it off. And in both cases, make sure it updates itself on a regular basis. Another question, we've got a bunch of questions. Thank you so much. Can computer accessories contain malware, like HDMI adapters that require software downloads or screen recording? So the answer is yes. I've not heard of any attacks through HDMI or other video, but there are attacks through USB devices. Not only, so a device that pretends to be a thumb drive, there is a possibility that that device could contain one of a number of attacks. One of them that I remember seeing as kind of popular for your obnoxious college buddies was one that would, that all it had was a what we call a capacitor in it. But when you plugged it in, it would accumulate electric voltage and then discharge all of that voltage into your motherboard and fry hopefully only your USB slots. In another case, though, we do know of a number of different types of USB-based attacks where you plug the USB drive into the USB port on your computer, and it will start self-executing an attack. So the moral of that particular story is, if you don't know where a USB drive came from, if it is sitting on the table and you don't know whose it was and it's not from a person you trust, you probably shouldn't plug it in. That's a general hygiene thing anyways. If you don't know something, don't plug it into something else. But yeah, USB drives, oftentimes a source of, or a possible source of attack. Let's see. Does DNS basically make sure that the site is real and its DNS is not suspicious? No. DNS is an actual service all computers use. Again, it stands for domain name service. And it's what allows you to type an actual address like www.google.com instead of the numeric address like 15.21.15.3 into the address bar on your web browser, right? So it does the address book lookup for you so that you don't have to do it actively. The DNS filtering, what that does is the company like Google or OpenDNS, they know about some threat actors and the websites that those threat actors use to do remote control, and they will not provide a translation for those. So if for some reason you mistakenly install ransomware on your computer, that ransomware can't phone home to find its master. I've read there are negatives to setting up DNS for a network. Is there any case where it doesn't make sense to turn that on? You can't operate on the internet without DNS, but I oftentimes recommend using a DNS service like OpenDNS or Google's DNS instead of the DNS provided from your ISP like Verizon or whomever, just for this reason that you get that extra level of filtering. Oh, yeah. I'm trying to remember if it made normal everyday computer internet more difficult or extra hoops. Nope, it's great. And in fact, in many cases, it's faster because organization like OpenDNS or Google, we've heard of them. They're a big one. These companies have a lot of resources behind them to have a very performant service. So I'm a big fan of DNS filtering. I would just go to use Google's DNS filtering. That's a real easy one, and they're pretty trustworthy for that. Let's see. What if I have fingerprint verification on for nearly every login for every site? Does that protect my data from being stolen, even if there is a malware? That's an interesting question. So fingerprint verification for your logins. So that's a different type of attack. What we're talking about, so Elisa asked this particular question. Elisa, the verification is more around management of what we call authentication, or proving you are who you say you are. So fingerprint, what we call biometric verification, is a tool that you can use to prevent somebody else from stealing your username and password. And we're going to talk about that in the second half of this conversation. What we're talking about here is managing malware. And so in that case, you may have installed malware on your local computer, and that malware then has access to everything on your computer, regardless of whether or not you have to log into an external website. Now, in the case of spyware, where they might be trying to steal your username and password, having that biometric authentication, which is one way, or the other authentication tools we use are like the text message, we call it two-factor authentication, or using Google Authenticator. Those tools, which we'll talk about it, those tools can prevent your username and password being useful for somebody who steals your username and password. Okay. So hopefully that answers that question. Can you repeat the other DNS you recommend that you said besides OpenDNS and Google? The third one is from Cloudflare. And we actually use them for a bunch of other stuff too. Like if you have a website that you are paying to host, I'm a big fan of Cloudflare. But that's kind of a side road I don't want to go down in this conversation. So Cloudflare, OpenDNS has a free service, and Google has a free service. All of them are very trustworthy. Cloudflare is a huge actor on the internet. They have a great reputation as a security-focused company. OpenDNS is owned by Cisco, and most of you at least have heard of Cisco. They're big in the networking and security space. And Google, of course, they're just concerned about the web working well. And so they have this free service that they operate. So in any one of those cases, they can provide DNS filtering for you. It's really kind of a no-brainer. You just either go on your router and say, this is the DNS server for everybody to use, or if you're just operating on your own computer or your phone, You just update the DNS settings. And that's something that you can easily learn how to do on like a WikiHow or something like that. So to finish some of the mitigations or preparations we can do. Now this is a little bit more complicated, but I'm a huge fan of it. What we like to recommend is not using an administrative account for your regular day-to-day use. So what does that mean? Normally when you set up your computer, you get to be a power user on your computer. You can install software, you can delete software, you can access everything on the computer. The problem is that if you launch a piece of software, that software launches as if it's you, the power user on the computer. And so it has all of the rights and permissions that you have on that computer. And so what you can do instead is you can create a second user that you use for your day-to-day. And so if you have to install QuickBooks or Microsoft Office, you log off, you log on as administrator, do the thing, and then you log off, and then you log back on as non-administrator, Bill or Bob or whatever. The cool thing about that is if you launch as a guest user or a standard user, that user doesn't have enough authority to install malware or spyware. And so the process is interrupted before it can even start. You're essentially handicapping yourself. It's a great way to mitigate that. And you might want to do the same thing if you have employees that work for you. You may want to disallow your employees also from having administrative access to their computers, right? Because they may inadvertently install something on their computers as well. So minimizing the use of those administrative accounts is a really great way to deal with that. The other thing, this is a side note, but also if you're going to let your kid use your computer or somebody who isn't involved in the business, also ask them to please use a guest account or create a guest account for them. The last thing you need to do is have your kid on your computer go to a website so that he can download a cool new plugin for the game that he wants to play and try to install it on your computer and instead install malware on your computer and disclose or delete all of the data on it, right? So you want to also protect the computer from other people who might be using that computer for other use. We've definitely had this issue at ITX, right? We issue computers to all of our people. And we had a circumstance where somebody during the pandemic let their kids do work on the computer because they needed to do work, right? It wasn't a malicious intent on the behalf of the person. But in that case, that was an unfortunate circumstance where they let their kid use the computer using their own credentials, their work credentials, and they had an unfortunate circumstance where we had to actually remotely wipe the device. And it was really unproductive for everybody involved. It was very sad. So try not to do that. And then finally, and I know this is like a higher level thing as well, but try to only install software from trusted source, right? So not only try to use it from use the App Store if necessary, but not necessarily install something from a link that comes in an email, right? Even if it's purporting to be coming from somebody you know. This is kind of a side artifact of people who use the impersonation attacks, right? So we'll talk about phishing a little bit in a moment, but in the same circumstance, you could get an email saying that it's from your spouse or from your coworker, and it's easy to get that information with social networks like LinkedIn and Facebook. So you get this email saying, hey, I need you to help me with this. Can you install this software and run this test for me or something like that, right? If you're not really absolutely sure of the source of that software application or that link, don't click it. Alternatively, like if they're saying, I need you to install QuickBooks, here's the link. Instead of clicking on a link, go to the QuickBooks website and download from the website. That way you know you're getting the software from the source. Same thing with Microsoft Office or anything else. You should have a downloader that you can download right from the source website where you're being very intentional about where you're obtaining that software. Okay. And I do want to say I appreciate all the great questions. They're really on target. And I hopefully, or I hope you're enjoying it as much as I am. So let's talk about impersonation attacks. This is two similar classes of attacks. They're essentially attacks where people are pretending to be who they're not, right? And the reason that they're doing it is, and this is almost entirely for financial gain, right? So they're trying to steal your credentials so that they can gain access to your bank account. They're trying to steal your credentials to gain access to the administrative login control for your website, right? Um, they're essentially trying to gain access to your credentials so that they can get access to the things that you have access to. In the case of phishing, this is somebody pretending to be somebody who knows you, right? So we see this happening in a few different classes of activities. So one of them is one of the really common ones, since everybody uses LinkedIn now, for instance, is a new employee will receive an email or a text message from somebody purporting to be their boss or the CEO. And this is a relationship that you can make out through the LinkedIn system. You only just need to pay the LinkedIn fee. It's like $5 or whatever. You can see everybody's little relationships. And the way it typically is, hey, this is Ralph, and I need to get your help. I'm busy in front of a customer, and I need you to buy a gift card for my client. Can you please get that and send it to this email address as an example? So go online, buy the online gift card, and send it to my customer, right, on my behalf. And so a new employee might be fooled thinking that they're taking care of their boss or their boss's boss, and they're doing something because somebody else is too busy and needs their help. And this is oftentimes the case in these kinds of attacks is they're enrolling you to help them because you want to be helpful, right? In general, most of us want to be helpful to other people. And so in the case of what we call these phishing attacks, we're going to have somebody who's purporting to be someone they're not to get you to do something you might not have otherwise done. I saw a circumstance where somebody sent an email to my client's accountant purporting to be the CEO of the company. And they said, I'm just getting on a plane. I need you to disperse a $10,000 payment to my customer XYZ company. Here is the bank account number to do the EFT transaction. And the staff accountant who knew that the CEO traveled a lot and was oftentimes on planes was just trying to be helpful. And they made a $10,000 payment to a bank account they had no information about other than the account number. Again, an unfortunate circumstance because in many cases, those transactions can't be reversed. So you really want to be thoughtful about the identity of the person, about verifying the identity of a person who's asking you to engage in some kind of a transaction. The sources of the attacks, they're typically going to be an email or in many cases a text message. It could come from a compromised website where you might launch malware. We talked about malware before, but you're sent to a compromised website or you go to a compromised website where a piece of software will launch an attempt to obtain your credentials. Or finally, simply having poor password hygiene. What this means is that if you or the people working from you don't use good passwords, then an attacker could potentially guess those passwords. It's not as hard as you think. The data out there suggests every year, around the first of the year, there's an email that goes around, or it's on a website, but it goes around on all the security chat rooms and stuff. And basically, they talk. What companies will do is they will analyze the passwords that have been used on their websites, and they will disclose the patterns that they see, essentially the top 100 passwords. And it's amazing to see that very, very commonly, the number one password is password or password 123, or some combination of that P @ S word, right? These are very easy to guess, and very easy to come up with as a way to get into somebody's bank account. Can my bank account, I have a question from someone, by the way, can my bank account information be misused if I provide it for a new client to make payment to be by ACH, for example? Um, Not typically, no. So if you give your ACH number to a client, I guess they could misuse it by paying you too much money. But I don't think you're complaining about that. um, the risk though is that if someone gains access to your ACH and they use it as a way to prove to somebody on your staff that they're really your banker. Hi, I'm your banker. I'm calling about account number X, Y, Z. You know, we need to do something. We need to do a fresh transaction, or I'm researching this. Can you help me out? Can you give me your login and password so we can look at this together? Right. Again, people want to be helpful. And any piece of information that attacker has to socially engineer their victim gives them the upper hand. So disclosing what we might consider private or confidential information might be something that you want to try to avoid, even though it can't be subverted in and of itself, right? Essentially, somebody can't extract money out of your bank with just the ACH number, but they might be able to extract information or assistance from somebody because because they try to show that they're the banker. Another question, does not using real photos of yourself make social media safer? Is Google Password Autofill Manager safe? Woof, couple questions there. I'd like to put the social media question in the parking lot if it's okay with you. The question about Google Password Autofill Manager is safe. It's probably safer than storing the passwords in a blank text file on your computer, which is not unusual for us to see. People will either have text files or spreadsheets or something like that where the text is stored in clear text. In those cases, it's definitely not safe. So using the Google password, so if this is the security of like a text file, which is no security, Google password's probably up here. It's pretty good. And I don't think Google would provide that service if it wasn't at least reasonably secure. If I had my druthers, I'd recommend that you take a look at an alternative. LastPass is pretty good. They've had a few breaches in the past, but I think they've cleaned their stuff up. That is an autofill one. There's one that's actually free for personal use. And another question is, where do you store yours? I personally use Bitwarden, and my wife uses Bitwarden because I ask her to. And we actually use Bitwarden at ITX too, for a slightly different reason. At ITX where I work, we use Bitwarden because we can run it on a server that we own, and so our data isn't being commingled with anybody else's data. That being said, of the top 3 or 4, they have not yet had a breach, and they're also free for the basic product. One of the things that I like is if you have a password manager, you want to have those passwords everywhere. And like LastPass, for instance, which is a really good product, makes you pay if you want to have it both on your computer and on your mobile phone, which means you're not likely to use it. So if you have a password autofill like a password manager, Bitwarden is the one that I'm a big fan of today, both because the price can't be beat, and also because it allows you to use it on multiple devices. They do have a premium version that you can use for a group if you have to share passwords amongst yourselves. It's pretty reasonably priced. And they also have a family plan too if you want to pay for it to make sure your kids have it and you want to share passwords in your family. But honestly, for most people, just having it standalone on your computer for free, it's great. I am familiar with Keeper. I think it's entirely web-based. But that they have a good reputation as well. I've got a client in the aerospace industry that uses Keeper, and they've done a very good job vetting it. So Lisa asked the question, "Are you familiar with Keeper?" And it has a pretty good reputation. The reason, again, I use the Bitwarden is because I can also have it on my mobile device it autofills. So like when I'm up to a web page or something that asks for a password, I can just tap on it and it fills it in. So I'm lazy and it keeps me from having to type it in. But Keeper is also another one that has a good reputation. Another question, are unsubscribed links and emails used as a portal? Is it better to label as spam versus using an unsubscribe link? I think it depends. If your unsubscribe is for something that you had previously subscribed to, it's probably a trustworthy organization and they're going to respect your request to unsubscribe. But if it's something that you don't know anything about and it's just a spammer, I would just as soon avoid clicking on their unsubscribe link. If nothing else, it validates that you're a real human being and not just a lousy email that they acquired. Let's see. Another question about small business person connects. When a small business person connects any of their personal or business devices to a public Wi-Fi network where passwords, if the business person has a VPN with a setting set not to allow internet use without VPN always being on, which risks of hack or compromise still exist, if any? Okay, so your question is, if you're traveling and you're using a public Wi-Fi and you still use a VPN so that all your stuff goes through the VPN, what risks do you still carry? And the short answer is it doesn't change things as much as it used to because almost all websites are using SSL. So we're still talking about credential stealing and stuff like that. And so the likelihood of your credential being stolen, either if you have a VPN or you don't have VPN, is pretty low. In either case, your credentials are going to be sent to the host server like Google or whatever in a way that's unreadable by another person on that network. And the reason Michael brings this up is because when we're traveling at a coffee shop or whatever, our computer is a small radio broadcast tower. So anybody within, that same space can listen in on everything that's being broadcast. And so we do want to protect that. If you're using a service that doesn't use SSL and has a password, I would suggest abandoning that service. But having the VPN in place mitigates other risks. The main thing it mitigates is that it doesn't allow people to see what you're doing. So you might have that for a couple of reasons, but the biggest one is to maintain confidentiality, right? Like you may not necessarily want people to know that you're visiting a website for like what banking website you visit, because they would see that in clear text, because that would give somebody a route to gain access to you. That would be considered confidential and it's not encrypted. Another thing that you might want to protect is something that might be private or personal. Like if you're a person who is getting therapy for any reason, you may not necessarily want that to be public knowledge. And so the use of a VPN service can protect you from having that information disclosed. Is there a way to block messages on LinkedIn from unknown accounts that seem to be bots? I don't know. Harry, you asked that. I don't think so, but I'm not, I don't use LinkedIn enough to know if there's a way to do that. I would open it up to, is there anybody else who knows how to block that? If somebody wants to share that on the chat, I can share that back to Harry. I'm not an expert on LinkedIn as a product, and I tend to disregard I get a lot of it too, Harry. Like it's really annoying. Hey, I want to connect with you or whatever. It's a bit of a pain, and I don't have a good answer on that one. So just to be complete on this particular slide, and again, awesome questions, so keep them up. And the impersonation attack, we've got these two types of attacks. One is where somebody steals your credentials, and the other is where somebody appears to be trustworthy and tries to steal other information or attack you in some other way. So what do we do if we've been attacked, if we determine that our credentials have been stolen? One is resetting those passwords, especially. This speaks back to hygiene as well. If you're the type of person who uses the same password everywhere, this is a big problem, right? Because you're going to need to reset the password on every single service you have. This is another benefit, by the way, of using a service like Bitwarden or LinkedIn, or not LinkedIn, Bitwarden or LastPass. If you're using a password keeper, right? One of the great things is you're not as uncomfortable about using different passwords everywhere, right? And it makes it a lot easier if you do have a breach credential of some sort. You only have to go to that one place where there might be a problem and that can be resolved. You're going to need to coordinate with an insurance company if your bank, for instance, has been attacked. This begs a secondary question, right? Which is you do want to make sure that you do have a relationship with your insurer, and that there are conversations about perhaps cyber insurance and coverage there. It's a great conversation to have, even if you don't choose to have it, because if you consume cyber insurance, oftentimes there's going to be people at that organization who are going to examine your business and ask you to make some changes to help you get that business locked down. So it's kind of like a free consultant, basically saying, here's some best practices that we see that can help you that you can use to help yourself. And then finally, report to the authorities. And again, some with a circumstance where there's been a data breach because of stolen credentials, that may be something that you have to report. In the case where it was just a simple breach, the FBI is still interested because the FBI actually has a task force that is concerned with cyber attacks and cyber terrorism. And so they also want to know what kind of attacks are happening and how they're happening and what they can do to help to prevent or mitigate them. So it's useful, and it's not something to be embarrassed about, right? I'm not going to say every organization falls prey eventually to attacks, but I can say some amazing organizations that have some really brilliant people still have issues. So who do you actually report to? Again, the FBI has an office here in town. Most of these attacks cross state or international boundaries. So the FBI actually is the organization that covers on or has the authority for that. The local businesses in general, sorry, local businesses, gosh, local state or police oftentimes don't have the authority, or in many cases, there isn't a law for them to pursue because a lot of the breach or security related stuff is really being done at the federal level. The only exceptions for that are things that we're not talking about here, like cases of personal attacks where, harassment, things like that. That might be something you might report to local law enforcement. But generally speaking, things that are attacking a business, that goes up to the federal level. So, knowing what the phone number is of the local FBI office is not a bad thing. I don't know if SCORE has a relationship with the FBI. I assume they do. So you could probably reach out through the SCORE organization to find a good TED, or do you know if we have a direct relationship or any kind of referral relationship?
Not to my knowledge, John.
Okay. Maybe it's something we should pursue. But you can just call the local FBI office here in Buffalo. They're physically in Buffalo, and you would actually have a very nice FBI agent who may have some experience with this stuff come and talk to you. And in many cases, if you're dealing with like um, like a ransomware attack or something and you're in the middle of it, oftentimes they can provide good advice. A second question from the same person, Deborah, should I use my personal phone for my business? Do folks get a second line? I don't have a good answer for that. I think that's more a question about protecting your personal boundaries. So I wouldn't think about it from a security perspective. Um, if you the one benefit of not using personal phones or not allowing your employees to use their personal phones, the one big benefit is that the relationship that your business has with your clients, the business owns that relationship because your clients are calling a business number. As small business owners, I think that that relationship is a little fuzzier. So you just want to figure out whether or not your customers want to have access to your personal number, where they might potentially invade your privacy after hours. One more question, and then I think we'll get on to the hopefully get on to the next slide. With private password protected Wi-Fi or mobile hotspot networks at home or Airbnbs where many other devices have connected, some without a doubt having infections on it, is the always VPN on device still hackable, infectable by the modem or router that was infected by earlier users? Could a bad actor silently monitor activities of the person feeling secure having the VPN always set on somehow? So again, great question. I'm going to answer that by basically saying if your computer is clean and secure and you're using a VPN that you leave on all the time, which is an excellent practice to protect your privacy, any traffic or data that might be detectable by somebody who is either listening in on the router or listening in on the radio broadcast that your device is outputting, any of that traffic is completely unreadable. So even if there's somebody else on the network who's been attacked, or somebody else on the network is an attacker, the VPN will provide protection on the traffic between your computer and any other system that your computer talks to. And in many cases, this is easy enough to implement. I do this for myself when I travel. My personal home firewall router device here at home actually has a little free VPN service built into it. It's great. And so whenever I travel, the first thing I do is connect back to my home network. And then all of I route all of my internet stuff through my home network and then back out. So what it does is it protects your privacy. It doesn't necessarily protect you from other types of attacks, but it does protect your privacy. What that means is people can't read any of the data that's going through. They can't see any of the websites that you've chosen to visit because some of that data might not necessarily be protected by SSL. So in other words, one traveling using the Wi-Fi at public Wi-Fi should feel safe using the network, no matter who connected to it or if any backdoor actors on the network. Yes, if you trust the VPN service, which is a little gotcha, but there are some good ones out there. If you trust the VPN service, any of your data is protected, and it's safe from anybody else who might have access to that network. So, there are some very good ones that have good reputations as good VPNs, or if it's something that you can provide for yourself, for your business, that's good. So yes, Mike. All right, we're good. Thank you, Michael, for that question. Lots of great questions, some of them technical. I hope everybody here is enjoying the conversation. So we talked about what to do if you do have a problem with stolen credentials. This one's a bit more of a bummer. Once you've had a breach, you have to essentially recover. So what can we do to mitigate for this, right? This is, again, being good scouts. We want to be prepared. My son's an Eagle Scout, so if you hadn't guessed, that's something that I'm coming to from my background. First and foremost, right? Avoid the use of untrustworthy systems. I misspelled that. For financial transactions. So what does that mean? It means, by systems, it means if you are being engaged to transact financially, be sure not to interact with a system that you can't trust, right? So that means if somebody sends you an email saying, I need you to do something, email is not what we consider a trustworthy system. In fact, just the opposite. Email was designed for one purpose. That one purpose was to get the mail through no matter what, right? Trustworthiness was never in the design for email. And so because of that, there's a lot of problems with people being able to impersonate or spoof, or simply not disclose who they actually are as an actor and still can send you email. An impersonator could, in many cases, send you an email as you to yourself. And many mail systems won't even filter that out. That's considered an allowed transaction for them. Again, email is designed to get the messages through, not to protect you or secure you. Right? So anything that's related to something financial, you should be basing those conversations or transactions starting from systems that you can trust. So, like, what does that mean? you go to the bank's website and you start from there, not from a link purporting to be your bank or purporting to be your credit card. Another good example is if you've got somebody who's a colleague or a friend or even your spouse asking you to make a payment for something, make sure you validate that that person is who they say they are, not necessarily trusting that they are who they say they are. Because in many cases, it might not necessarily be that they are who they say they are, right? We have actually a couple of protections in place, right? One of the things that we do is that any transaction that is being requested to our accounting system that's more than a very small value actually gets confirmed by voice over the phone. Um, by voice over the phone, as opposed to just taking it as, this is trustworthy. So that's a good example. Got somebody who has the FBI. Oh, this is excellent. We're going to share that in the email that we send out after, if that's okay, Ted. One of our guests or attendees has an actual contact that she shared from the Buffalo FBI desk that
Great.
that she shared with us. So Ted, can you share that out to all of our attendees?
Sure, I will do that.
Awesome. Perfect. Thank you very much for sharing that. I really appreciate that. So again, if you're going to do a financial transaction, go back and make sure that you're validating who the person is who's making that financial request. Another thing you can do is, in many cases, you can have financial limits on authorized users with your bank. So, wow, we are really running out. So, for instance, we have a $10,000 limit above which our CEO can't is the only person who's authorized to make transactions, and that's a good way to do some filtering. Again, top is use multi-factor or two-factor authentication everywhere that it's possible and available. This is your Google account, it's your bank account, anywhere where you can have that text message or anything like that. You should include that in the you should activate that so that people can't steal your username and password. If you have two-factor authentication turned on an account, if somebody steals your username and password, they can't use it. All right. So this is really important. If there is nothing else that you took away from tonight's call, it would be this: turn on two-factor authentication everywhere. Turn on your DNS filtering. Again, that's a filter for impersonation. Avoid clicking on links in emails that you're not expecting or text messages. And then again, talk to your insurer about cyber insurance, especially as your business grows and you're handling your risk a little bit more. So top 3 things, right? This is our summary. Top 3 things. Make sure that your users are using multi-factor or two-factor authentication. I cannot stress it enough. Good identity management is core to good computer security. Second, review and test your backups regularly. Really super important to do. And then finally, train your team. Talk to them about, how they'll know it's actually you. Like you can say, I will never send you an email to execute a financial transaction for me, right? Or if you get an email, call me just to make sure. Or, here's a safe word that we can use when we're texting each other so that we can validate that we are who we say we are, right? So if you think ahead and you plan and prepare, even if you do fall prey to an attacker, you can be protected and protect yourself. All right. There was one other question in here that was related to social networks. I'm looking back in the list. Is there some kind of filter for unwanted text on an iPhone? Not necessarily. You can receive an SMS from anywhere. What you can do though is twofold. You can change the view of your messages on your iPhone so that it only shows people who are already in your contact lists. And then the other thing you can do is any message that you get on an iPhone, you can report it as junk. And if you do that, then your iPhone will automatically block it for you as well. So you won't receive additional messages from that particular spammer. So, so that would be what I would suggest there is, if you're getting spam, if it's really awful, it's really hard. Again, SMS is kind of like email. It's designed to get messages through. If you have somebody who's truly an attacker, you may want to consider using, there are some paid services from organizations like AT&T and Verizon that will actually do some front-end filtering for you. I would be remiss if I was to not say you might have to change your phone number, but that's kind of like going nuclear on your phone in order to not get those texts. So I would probably start by just using the view filter so you're not actually looking at messages that you're not expecting to see. And I'm trying to find, there was one other question that was related to social networks that I asked. Oh, does not reusing real photos of yourself make social media safer? Is Google Pat? I don't have a really good answer for that. I don't think for most of us, having people know what you look like is a problem, at least not in terms of computer security. If you're being more directly targeted, and this is more a question around your personal safety. So if for some reason somebody knows who you are and they're within your social network, but they're still somebody who you might consider an attacker, them knowing what you look like allows them to identify you before you've identified them. So, but it's more of a personal safety or a personal interaction, right? So somebody approaches you, they say that they're friends with your brother-in-law, and they seem to know who you are. That's a risk that might be compounded by, somebody having access to your picture ahead of time. So in any circumstance, every piece of information an attacker has, they may use to their own advantage to ingratiate themselves to you, or to build trust with you or build rapport, right? So in the case of that circumstance where a threat actor is approaching you in person at a bar or a restaurant or something like that, that's kind of a stalking issue, but it would be something where if your face was online and known publicly, it's going to be a higher risk. We are almost out of time. Ted, are we allowed to go over? Because we've got a couple of the questions in here.
Well, it's up to you, John. I would just say for those folks that have to leave us at 8 o'clock, we will be sending the link to the recording of this session and the PDF copy of the slides. So, but yeah, feel free if you have time to go ahead and answer the questions, go ahead.
Yeah, I definitely don't mind answering a few more questions. There's a few more that just popped up in the list, and I don't want to shortchange anybody for coming and attending. So the next question is there any advantage in terms of security to using the paid version of Yahoo, or is Gmail more secure? There's a couple of questions there. Yahoo used to be terrible in terms of security, and Google is definitely better. In both cases, the level of security you're getting on the system is pretty good as long as you activate multi-factor or two-factor authentication. I think personally, Google does a better job of it, and Microsoft does as well. The real benefits to paying for the service are twofold. One is you actually have access to real paid customer support once you're a paying customer. So if you have a problem getting into your account or something like that, you actually have somebody who will call and who will answer your phone call. And then the other advantage is like you get a lot more storage space and you get a bunch of other services that you might not get with the base version of Gmail, the free version of Gmail. Oh, and I think they don't show you ads as interstitials in your email. So that's a Gmail thing as well. I'm not as big of a fan of Yahoo. I haven't used it for many years. They used to be very, very poor on security. Like everybody knew that if you had a Yahoo address that had been compromised, it was pretty bad. Um, Second question, wondering if any advantages to using VoIP as a business phone number. I think it's a great idea. In fact, if you have Gmail, if you're using the Google service, there's a service called Google Voice that you can get as part of the $5 a month Gmail service. So in addition to be able to use your own domain name with Google email, like, bob@mycompany.com, you can also get a free phone number in a local area code that you can use as a business or a front end number that's separate from your cell number. It's a nice way to maintain privacy or maintain boundaries with your customers. And it's reasonably inexpensive compared to most VoIP services are like $20 a month. So I'm a big fan of Google Voice. It works well. If I had an importer attack, could it have been because I had my email address on my website? I don't have a good answer for that. I don't have enough background. Usually what we see in terms of having email addresses on websites, though, is that you're more likely to be a target of spam rather than a target necessarily of an attacker per se. It's just an annoyance, though, is like there are robots out there that are out scraping websites looking for email addresses that they can then aggregate and sell to other people to either to attack via phishing attacks or whatever. So in general, it's a good idea to not necessarily list your email address on your website, but to use a contact us form. Let's see. Michael asked a second question following up about VoIP. Are there any disadvantages? The big disadvantage is that there might be an additional cost per month. But I personally like having, especially if you're going to post your website, that phone number on your website or whatever. It's a nice little boundary there that you can say people aren't going to call me on my cell number or my personal number when I'm goofing off on the weekend, and I don't really want to be bothered. So imposter attack. I see imposter attack. I don't think having your website, your email on your website would be likely for somebody to gain access to other credentials. But it's more troubling because it opens up your email to targeted attacks like phishing attacks. So like I said, in general, a contact us form is an excellent way to communicate with clients. And it makes it so that you don't necessarily have to disclose your email address. Another question about VoIP. So from a privacy or security perspective, if business or personal phone number gets doxed, perhaps VoIP would be helpful. It could be. The other thing that I like about my Google Voice is that you can go into the Google Voice administration pane on their website, and you can actually, from there, you can block incoming phone numbers. They actually do a bunch of spam blocking right within the Google Voice service as well. So hopefully that answers your question about that is, having that external number can create some separation, mostly between your personal and public life. But there are some tools that you get from that paid service that you don't necessarily get from your cell carrier or home phone number. How do you feel about Proton email service as a private and encrypted email service? It's essentially the way I feel about it. It's essentially the equivalent of a burner phone. Is it a bad thing or a good thing? No, I think it could be a useful tool. If you're trying to get like a white paper or something like that, it's a great way to gain access without having to disclose your personal information to a company that you don't necessarily trust or that you don't necessarily want to disclose that information. So from that perspective, Proton and email, at like the equivalent of a burner phone is a nice way to avoid having to deal with the hassle of giving your personal information in exchange from something that might not have any value at all. So in that case, where it's oftentimes used as well, like if you're reaching out to somebody, we see it oftentimes with people sending in resumes. So it might not necessarily be as appropriate in this context, but like somebody will send in their resume using a Proton Mail account only because they might still be gainfully employed at someplace else and they don't want us to know where they're currently employed, right? So, but Proton is a great service for protecting your privacy. when you're starting a conversation with somebody via email. So is it good or bad? It's a tool. It can protect your identity when you're trying to maintain a little bit of an anonymity. But I don't think it's good or bad. It's just a thing. It does the job. They have a great reputation. They do a really good job not storing any logs or any kind of data like that, which is excellent because in some cases, if you're transacting in a way where you don't necessarily want those transactions to be monitored, Proton Mail doesn't keep any logs of those either, which is kind of nice. An example of that might be somebody who is like doing something that's legal here in New York, but not necessarily might be legal in another state or something like that. A great example is if you're in the THC business or marijuana, it's legal here in New York, but the feds still consider it illegal. So you may want to protect your identity if you're asking or doing research and your email is going to go across the state lines because suddenly it goes into the federal jurisdiction. So, that would be a use case where I might not necessarily want my email attached to the research that I'm doing. I think I've answered all the questions that are queued up. Are there any other questions out there? Thank you. I appreciate the compliment. I think we're going to be doing these sessions. Ted, were we thinking quarterly for the next few quarters?
Yes, over the next 3, I think. And yeah, John, wonderful information. I wrote down something that I'm going to be doing, which is don't use admin accounts for day-to-day work. That's something I'm going to take to heart. So, but a lot of great information. Thank you for answering all those questions on behalf of our attendees.
My pleasure.
And we look forward to having you do some additional workshops for us. And we'd like to thank everybody for being here tonight and being at the webinar. Just remember that you can go to score.org and also to our chapter website, buffaloniagara.score.org. And for looking at what's coming up for future workshops. Thanks to everybody. Thanks again, John. And we will be sending out the link to the recording and the PDF copy of the slides. You'll get that by tomorrow. So thanks. Great. Have a great evening, everyone, and good night.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.